time for Chapter 10 of Girlcott by Florenz Webbe Maxwell. The sun seemed to be competing with the fireplace by the time I left school on my lunch break, ran all the way to Girlcott Lane and on to Papa's garage. I was thankful that school regulations allowed us to take off our blazers and go into summer uniform after May 24th, for my cotton blouse could be peeled off my skin like a Band-Aid. Not a breeze was blowing, so the trees and shrubs were standing at attention. When I neared Mrs. Williams's cottage, I was surprised to see her leaning on her gate, beckoning to me. "Hello, my precious," she said when I approached. Her usual smile did not reach her eyes, and I noticed there were worried lines on her forehead. She grabbed my hand and then glanced up and down the lane as if expecting someone to appear. "I don't want to upset your mama," she whispered, "but a lot of cars have been going back and forth to your father's garage. Something doesn't seem right." Cars are always going back and forth to Papa's garage, I thought. But since Mrs. Williams was not nosy like Mrs. Charter, I was worried. "White men were in those cars," she added before I could comment. "I would say at least 6 cars drove by in the last hour. One just left about 15 minutes ago." She shook her head and the worry lines deepened. "I just don't know what to think." "It might not be anything to worry about. I'm going there now," I said, trying to reassure her, even though my heart was thumping so hard it was almost painful. As I hurried off, she called after me, "Be sure to let me know if anything's wrong." I wondered if those cars had anything to do with the boycott. I could hear Mama's warning that if I feared something, I was giving it power over me, but I couldn't help myself. When I reached Papa's garage, I noticed with relief that there was nothing unusual. His feet were sticking out from under a truck I recognized as belonging to Mr. Taylor, who had a business hauling rubbish back and forth to the Pembroke dump. I could not equate that old truck or Mr. Taylor with any boycott. I remembered when he first bought that scrap for Papa to fix, and I told Papa he needed to drag it to the dump for its final resting place. Papa only laughed. The joke ended up on my face, for the truck was soon repaired with a new motor and a proper sign designed by Benny that read, "We tailor your trash." Papa painted the truck bright green with the letters emblazoned in large black calligraphy. When fat Mr. Taylor saw the results, he bounced up and down down the garage like an elephant in ballet shoes. "Hi, Papa," I yelled, hoping he could hear under the belly of the truck. With one sweep, he dragged his head out into the open, sprang to his feet, and leaned on the bonnet. He then wiped his oily hands with a towel hanging from his overalls. Although he seemed pleased to see me, I noticed 3 horizontal lines on his forehead, and his usual smile didn't turn up the corners of his mouth. "Well, hello there, my Desma. School's out already?" "I'm on my lunch break. I'm just here to pick up my post office book. I need to take some money off." I spoke quickly, deciding to be honest, yet hoping he wouldn't ask any questions. He did, but then again, this did not surprise me, for my parents never interfered with my post office savings. It was my money, and I was not in the habit of spending it unwisely. "Just don't be late for school," he said as he slid back under the truck. It was then that I became anxious. Papa not only seemed preoccupied, but his tone gave me the feeling that he did not want me hanging around the garage. I decided not to ask him about the cars Mrs. Williams had seen, especially since he didn't bring up the subject. Despite the noonday heat, I shivered when I entered the office. Papa had not opened any of the windows, so the air was stuffy. Did I shudder because of a premonition, or was I getting boycott fever? I looked around at the usual disarray. Motor magazines were all over the desk, and some on the floor. There was no time for tidying up, so I reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out the cigar box with my post office box covered with old car keys, nails, and screws. I shook off the objects and held the small book as if it were sacred. There was an impulse to put it back and forget about taking any money off. After all, I had saved up babysitting money earned from the Wallaces and monetary gifts given at Christmas and birthdays. I opened the book and stared at the 99 pounds 10 shilling balance. A movie ticket cost 1 shilling and 6 pence per person, and there were 36 of us in class. That would mean giving Benny's ex 2 pounds 7 shillings. It was more money than I had ever taken out at once. The eager look on Eileen's face flashed before me. With this amount, we could get the class into the theater without drawing attention to the picketers outside. By paying the money in advance, all we had to do was walk into the theater quietly and sit in the white people's seats. Since we would not be breaking a law, because there was no law to break, segregation would be broken down in the theater. No more segregated seats. If only we could carry out our plan tonight. But I told myself if the boycott did continue until Saturday, our success would be more dramatic. I carefully placed the cigar box back in the drawer, closed it with a silent prayer, and started to leave Papa's office. As I was about to step out of the office, an ear-splitting screeching of brakes shattered the silence. A car door slammed. Someone shouted. I rushed to the window and gaped at the scene. Mr. Townsend, one of Papa's richest customers, was leaning on the door of his black Hellman minx, shouting and waving an envelope at Papa. Lionel Johnson, his voice was as loud as a siren. I have here the names of folks who will no longer be using your garage. I craned my neck to see Papa giving Mr. Taylor's truck the final polish. He turned his head slowly, looking Mr. Townsend up and down, and then asked, Is something the matter? The tone indicated that Papa was controlling his anger. I held my breath, conscious that my heart was beating like a bird trapped in a cage and struggling to escape. This was probably similar to the scene acted out by the men Mrs. Williams saw driving up and down the Girlcott lane. I moved away from the window, but caught enough of the view so that I could not miss what was going on. Mr. Townsend marched towards the truck and dropped the envelope on the bonnet. He then stepped back like an actor retreating off stage. I watched when he reached his car and leaned on the open door. He must have finally realized that his behavior had not frightened my father, for his face reddened, and the off-center part of his thin brown hair made his nose look too far to the right of his face. He opened his mouth several times like a fish gasping for breath, and then he finally spoke, slowly, with menace dripping from his voice. This is about that boycott tonight, the one you folks are staging to intimidate white folks who helped you get on your feet. I'm not staging any boycott, so I don't know what you're talking about, Papa was really trying hard not to lose his temper. You jolly well know what I'm talking about. I know you're supporting those boycott hoodlums. All you colored people are supporting them. Well, two can play this game as well. People like me are also staging a boycott, and that's to put people like you out of business. We put you in business, we can take you out. Jack Townsend, you and your kind can't take me out of business because you didn't put me in. I started this garage from scratch and made it successful because I believe in giving good service to all of my customers, including you. I wanted to shout bravo to my father, for I too had told Mr. Wallace that Papa had started his business from scratch and had made it successful. Mr. Townsend opened his car door wider. He raised his voice louder and peppered it with arrogance. Let me tell you something, Lionel. You colored people never had it so good. Take a look at colored people in other parts of the world and you'll appreciate what I'm saying. They live like dogs. They're hungry. They're dirty. They're poor. Look at you. You're nothing but an ungrateful, anti-establishment troublemaker. I could feel my blood sizzling and hoped Papa was going to give Mr. Townsend his entire mind. No stopping, no holding back. What Papa said next disappointed me. His voice was calm, and it did not put Mr. Townsend in his place. Thank you for anything you think you have done to make this garage a success, but I'll manage. God is in charge, not you and your kind. I flopped down in the chair and leaned back, bloated with fury. What kind of comeback was that? Why didn't Papa tell him off? Put him in his place. This made me more determined to carry out my plans with the boycott. Papa, Mrs. Burroughs, the progressive group were all alike. They just didn't understand that these white people were only keeping them segregated with a stupid policy. De facto, not de jure, as Eileen explained. The law had teeth, policy did not. Mr. Townsend seemed satisfied with Papa's answer, for I heard his car door slam, and he revved his engine like a bad temper. I peeped out of the window just in time to see him drive down Girlcott Lane, leaving a ribbon of thick black smoke behind him. When I looked at my watch, I realized I should be heading back to school or I would be late again. There was no way I could get to the post office. To make matters worse, I was too annoyed to walk past Papa without showing my disappointment. So I tucked the post office book in my blouse pocket and walked slowly outside. Forgot you were inside, Papa said, folding up the rag he had in his hand. I could tell he wasn't pleased that I had heard the altercation between him and Mr. Townsend. I have to hurry or I'll be late for school, I said, not looking in his direction. This gave me the excuse to leave without revealing just how disappointed I felt. Papa reached out his hand and held me before I could make another step. Still not looking him in the face, I glanced over at the envelope on the bonnet of Mr. Taylor's truck. How are we going to make it out now that you've lost so many customers? I didn't want to sound as if I were blaming him, but my words came out laced with the annoyance I felt. Papa pulled me to his side and put an arm around my shoulder. With his free hand, he picked up the envelope and crushed it in his palm. The lion's power lies in our fear of him, he said. I looked up at Papa's face and could not stop myself from smiling. You sound just like Mama. I didn't add that I felt the same way about fear when Mrs. Williams told me that cars with white men were driving up and down the lane. People like Mr. Townsend can turn this boycott into a bloodbath. He did everything to make me lose control. He came very close, Papa said. His fists were clenched and his eyes bulged as he stared into the distance. He seemed to forget I was standing next to him. Fear crawled inside me, and when I spoke, my voice shook. Papa, he was awful. He was even worse than the Wallaces. I wanted you to tell him off, even punch him, put him in his place. Papa rubbed my shoulders and looked down at me. His eyes now returned to their normal shape. None of that would have worked. He wanted me to become violent so he could have arrested me for abuse. But he started it, Papa. He was rude to you. You should have at least pushed him back in his car. Just talking to him the way you did made him look like he was in charge of you. I raised my voice. Papa had the situation all wrong. The law was never on our side when it came to offending white people. They could pull in your mortgage, take your job, and do anything they want. And we're having a boycott just to sit next to them in the theater? You should have seen how Mr. Townsend looked, like Mr. Powerful. I couldn't believe I raised my voice to Papa, but the thought of my birthday celebration being spoiled for something so ridiculous made me angry. Papa didn't seem to notice. His voice remained calm. Not getting in a fight with him was not a sign of weakness, Desma. He wanted me to be violent and stoop to his level. Losing control is not a victory. This boycott is not about sitting next to white people. It's about money. To people like Mr. Townsend, it's all about money and trying not to lose it. That's what they're afraid of, losing money, losing power. Something was beginning to make sense. No wonder I was supposed to get all of the money by this afternoon. Even without knowing how many seats were in the theater, I could calculate that in one night, the theater people could lose several £100s. I moved closer to Papa and slipped my hand in his. He squeezed mine. If people stayed away from the theater tonight, think of how much money the theater loses. The longer the boycott, the more money is lost. We win by striking their pocketbooks, not striking them in the face. Papa had read my mind. If they lose that much money in a night, the boycott wouldn't last long, would it? Deep down, I was still hoping everything would be over by Saturday. Papa shook his head. That's hard to say. Those progressive group folks seem determined to break down segregation by making the theater folks feel the blows in their pockets. People like Mr. Townsend are determined to show us colored people that they're not going to be intimidated. I've had cars driving in all morning hoping to break me down. Why you? You're not part of the progressive group. I didn't dare let on I knew at least two people who were. I have a garage, Desma. Men are in and out of here talking politics. All we do is talk, but Mr. Townsend believes that if he scares me, I can get the word out not to support the boycott. Fear can spread like a forest fire, but I'm not afraid of people like him, and he got that message. The money part of the boycott was really beginning to make sense, even the part about not losing your temper. I could feel my post office book burning in my pocket, and now it was my turn to feel ashamed, embarrassed. Papa, I think I'd better get off to school. My lunch break is almost over. I moved my hand out of his and looked at my watch. I would never get to school before the first bell if I did not run the entire way. Let me drive you. Give me a minute to clean up and we can stop by Joey's lunch cart and pick up something to eat. No need worrying your mama about what's been happening. I hurried back inside the garage and dropped my savings book into the cigar box. I didn't even bother to put it under the clutter of old keys, nails, and screws. Hurry, Desma, you don't want to be late, Papa called while I was still staring at the closed drawer. When I climbed into the car, I gave him a quick kiss on the cheek. Thank you, Papa, I said. He didn't ask for what, but I could tell he understood.